Well, when I was here 40-some years ago, AJ was still pretty much a notorious character as far as I could tell on this campus. And so talking about him was in itself a radical action, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
Stand a little closer. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that would be good.
Not too bad.
Is that better?
Try that.
Can you hear me now? Still not.
Not much. I mean, it's not closer, maybe. Closer?
Maybe like 2 or 3 inches from it.
Now? No?
Better.
Now.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll sit here. Okay. So AJ was a notorious character, and being here to talk about him was an act of radicalism in itself, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And I'm thoroughly enjoying being back now and seeing the evolution that has occurred over the years, seeing that there's now a Peace and Studies minor, that a wonderful conference like this is welcome and being hosted here. And I just have to say, in a general way, that I so appreciate everybody who has been carrying on the legacy of A.J. Muste. The people in the trenches. We had Brad Little a few minutes ago, and all like him who've been out there all these years. The Muste Foundation, AKA Muste Institute, and everybody in the scholarly world who has kept this up. Lila's book was so welcome because it broadens and it deepens our understanding of this story that I first tried to tell. I have to say that the work that David has done, crossing the country with Kathleen, capturing all of these voices of these people who knew him personally, and it's just a great gift to posterity, as well as to all of us who are involved at this point. And Kathleen, your work on this, where did she go?
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Your work on this conference is just turned out to be such a wonderful gift to all of us too. So I'm so appreciative of that. I have to tell you though, when I talk about David, that when he and Kathleen came to visit me, the thing that I think I liked the best was that he let me sit behind the wheel of his BMW.
Convertible.
Convertible. And that was so special because I've never owned a car. I do not know how to drive. And so there was this minute of living in an alternate universe that I just absolutely loved. Also want to note that my daughter Ellie is here. She was in elementary school when I, what do I want? I dedicated Abraham Went Out to her and her brother. Now here she is with 2 teenage kids who wish she were back home taking care of them, and a job that is very, very demanding, traveling all over, keeping programs for after school and summer programming for kids going throughout the state of Maryland. But she found the time to make it possible to get me here, and so I'm very grateful to Ellie. Thank you, Ellie. This paper, I'm kind of going off the beaten path a little bit. It's going to be partly autobiographical. There's a lot of octogenarian rumination in it. And so it's a little different from anything that we've talked about so far, I think. A word about the title. You may notice that the Many-Headed Hydra has a lowercase h. And that was purposeful because we're not going to talk about Greek mythology. We're going to use Merriam-Webster's definition, which is, when it's not capitalized, a multifarious evil not to be overcome by a single effort. So that's where that title comes from. Okay, here we go. We'll see what you think. I was 1 month and 5 days shy of my 3rd birthday when Paul Tibbets, piloting the US B-59 bomber Enola Gay, released the atomic bomb over Hiroshima. I was too young to have a conscious memory of how those around me responded to that and the subsequent incineration of Nagasaki, but I can't remember a time growing up when I did not know that something terrible had come into the world. The Federal Office of Civil Defense contributed to this knowledge with pamphlets that showed up in the family mailbox. Their graphics were self-explanatory, and once I learned to read, my vocabulary included such terms as ground zero, firestorm, radiation poisoning. I listened to the radio a lot and heard many discussions of fallout shelters and controversy about those who had them, would they be obligated to open them to those who didn't? And there were the absurd duck and cover drills in school. Nobody discussed these things with me. Not my family, not my teachers, not other kids. In high school, after books and movies like On the Beach came out, I tried, albeit with very limited success, to raise the topic a few times, and I wrote a term paper for an English class about the insanity of the creators of human civilization creating the means of blowing it into oblivion. My teacher gave the paper an A, but we never discussed it. I had encountered the first layer of what A.J. Muste would later deplore as the thick crust of indifference with which most human beings distance themselves from the eventualities of nuclear destruction. When I entered Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois in 1960, I discovered the Student Peace Union and learned that the campus chapter was linked to a national group, which was part of a worldwide network of organizations, some of which had been working to end war long before the atomic era. What a revelation, and truly such a relief to finally have an outlet for my feelings and questions about war and the bomb. The SPU peace activists with whom I joined were relatively few in number, but bolstered by a few faculty and even a couple of faculty wives. We tried to educate ourselves, others on campus, and people in town about the pressing issue of US and Soviet above-ground testing of nuclear weapons. In March of 1962, 13 of us piled into 3 cars headed for Washington, D.C. There, we joined a 3-day protest of some 5,000 students from across the country, augmented by a delegation of the anti-nuclear movement in Great Britain. We picketed the Kennedy White House and the Soviet Embassy. We visited elected officials in the US House and Senate. We demanded an end to atmospheric nuclear testing. Now, I was so uninformed at that time, I had no idea that Kennedy and Khrushchev really wanted this, although there was a hint because Kennedy sent out big urns of hot coffee because it was cold and snowing. So clearly we weren't too unwelcome there. When the US, Soviet Union, and Great Britain signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty 5 months later, it felt good to have had a part, however small, in this historic first effort to reduce the nuclear threat. And I also had no idea until I heard Dr. Flax last night say that they wanted to have this test ban maybe because they wanted to be able to use conventional weapons for things that were going to be happening in Vietnam. But I wasn't aware, I just was where I was at that point. During this time, I was reading everything I could find about peace movements, including Fellowship magazine. I found the articles by and about A.J. Muste to be especially thought-provoking and began looking for more information about him. In my senior year, when I needed a topic for an honors thesis, I focused on Muste and 2 other distinguished figures with histories in the peace and anti-nuclear movements, theologian Reinhold Niebuhr and British philosopher Bertrand Russell. I made a good faith effort to objectively assess the thought and roles of Niebuhr and Russell, but I was really drawn to Muste. He was free of bombast and made the cause for pacifism in terms that were relatable. He often said that while he knew he was more right than those who dismissed his arguments for ending war, that did not make him more righteous. Even more compelling for me was his dogged pursuit of peace, a peace rooted in social justice and economic equality. No matter how morally complex, personally demanding, and physically dangerous that pursuit became, he carried on. After withstanding the tumult and hardships of opposing the First World War, he waded into the labor wars of the 1920s and 30s. For a time, he stood shoulder to shoulder with violent revolutionaries. However, he found their faith that the ends justifies the means to be fatally flawed. So he shifted his revolutionary mission back onto pathways toward peace and the beloved community. Stony and steep as those paths became, he stayed the course. His perseverance and depth of experience, he'd explored both violent and nonviolent ways of life, gave him unique credibility that inspired me as an undergraduate student. It made graduate studies with the early years of his life as the topic for my dissertation very meaningful. And it made writing Abraham Went Out a personally fulfilling project. I met Muste once in April 1964 as I was finishing the honors thesis. The American Friends Service Committee hosted a conference at a center called Lake Villa in northern Illinois to explore the question, nonviolence, tactic or way of life. They asked Muste to serve as the dean. When I saw the announcement, I sent him a note asking if he would give me a few minutes to discuss my thesis with him. He replied in the affirmative, and I signed up for the conference. A motherly faculty wife paid the registration fee and supplied bus fare. Muste was not at his best that weekend. He was some weeks away from cataract surgery, and he got kind of crotchety when the lights couldn't be fixed and they were making glare when he was trying to read his notes. Nonetheless, his conference opening account of the labor campaigns to which he had contributed was spellbinding. This was history straight from the lived experience of the history maker. When we met the next day, Muste was patient and kind. He managed to extract from my banal questions meaningful points of discussion without a hint of condescension. He almost always based his interactions with others on the premise that, as he told me that day, individuals must be free to express what they are at any given moment and should not be coerced or expected to be other than they are at that moment. He accepted me as I was, brimming with book learning and big ideas about peace, with only the shakiest foundation of real-world experience on which to ground them. I perceived in his empathy a template for nonviolence as a way of life. Between then and his death in February 1967, Muste soon entered upon that punishing pace of organizing, speaking, writing, marching, protesting, seeking an end to the war in Vietnam. Twice he made the grueling journey to Indochina, getting arrested and thrown out of South Vietnam, meeting amid the destruction and chaos of unremitting warfare with Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam. I cannot get it out of my head or my guts, he declared, that Americans are way over there, not only shooting at people, but dropping bombs on them, roasting them with napalm, and all the rest. His anguish reverberates now as American leaders and American weapons bear heavy responsibility for the current slaughter in Gaza. Looking back through a lens of nearly 6 decades since Muste's death, the anguish only deepens. The landscape is ravaged by human-made violence that just never abates. Muste did extensive reading of and outreach to the thinkers and the scholars of his day, including Hannah Arendt, Martin Buber, David Reisman, Albert Einstein. Recalling this practice, I've been trying to find sources to help me think about ongoing peril, including recent research on the nature of violence. I've perused articles in the Routledge International Handbook of Violence Studies and various online journals. I've found especially absorbing the textbook authored by Bandy X. Lee. Her name may be familiar for her publications on and organizing efforts to raise alarms about the mental health of Donald Trump. This led to her banishment from the American Psychiatric Association and cost her the faculty position she held at Yale for 17 years. The August 2022 issue of Mother Jones offers details and perspective on these developments in an essay titled "The Psychiatrist Who Warned Us That Donald Trump Would Unleash Violence Was Absolutely Right." Her textbook, published pre-Trump, is titled "Violence: An Interdisciplinary Approach to Causes, Consequences, and Cures." In this work, Lee, a psychiatrist with a master's degree in theology, reviews studies of violence by scholars in the fields of biology, psychology, sociology, anthropology, political science, and environmental research. And she provides historical context in her synthesis of their findings. Now, I want to underline this. I am far from having mastered this material, and I'm probably going to be saying some stuff that you're just going to roll your eyes at and think, you know, I got it wrong, and I probably did, but we'll go forward. So I dare to raise a few points for reflection. Dr. Lee begins from the heartening premise that violence is human-generated and therefore has human solutions. The much-hyped thesis associated with ethologist Conrad Lorenz and biologist E.O. Wilson that violence is an inescapable human trait appears in the light of interdisciplinary research to be an erroneous oversimplification. To fixate on ape origins and the supposedly iron laws of evolution is to denigrate human complexity, ignore the impact of social and cultural forces, and miss the crucial difference between violence and aggression. Aggression, Lee observes, is plentiful in other primates, but violence is almost uniquely human. Aggression, in addition to warding off threats, can be productive and creative. In non-human primate groups, when aggression is used to ward off a threat or resolve a conflict, once the purpose is achieved, aggressive behavior subsides, unlike in most human societies where, absent productive outlets, aggression degenerates into violence. Another essential distinction, one that I think all of us know well here, is that between violence and power. Lee discusses violence as a guise to ward off feelings of powerlessness. Individuals and countries employ violence often out of insecurity and fear. The hallmarks of power are freedom and well-being, which violence can never achieve. It only produces ever more deadly forms of peril in a futile quest for dominance and security. Yet, most of our fellow humans buy into this quest and the complex culture of violence which it produces. Lee discusses violence in terms of 3 forms that it takes: behavioral, structural, and catastrophic. Most familiar is behavioral violence, which manifests in our streets and various public and domestic areas on a daily basis. Its causes are rooted in the less obvious and more lethal labyrinth of structural violence, which she describes as the avoidable limitations society places on groups of people through structures that prevent them from meeting their basic needs. Put simply, structural violence refers to the discrimination and exploitation by white supremacy, by homophobia, by xenophobia, by all the rest, that trap vast numbers of people in poverty and despair. A.J. Muste did not use this language, but he was clear that peace and justice are indivisible, and that moralistic condemnations of violence without robust efforts to address the inequities and deprivations at its source will never create sustainable peace. When he assumed leadership of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and really all of the time he was there were traditional pacifists who were alarmed that he identified such factors as economic inequality and racism as forms of violence. Today, activists and scholars recognize the deadly impact of structural violence. Poverty, as the Poor People's Campaign declares, is the fourth leading cause of death in the United States. James Gilligan, in a study titled "Violence, Our Deadly Epidemic and Its Causes," calculated its worldwide impact, finding that every 15 years on average, as many people have died because of relative poverty as would die in a nuclear war. This is not to say that the lethalness of warfare, the defiling of planet Earth, the continuing buildup and proliferation of nuclear weapons, what Dr. Lee labels catastrophic violence, poses any lesser threat to human survival. If peace and justice are indivisible, advocates cannot afford to prioritize structural over catastrophic violence, or vice versa. No justice, no peace. No peace, no sustainable justice. The challenge is to marshal the physical, mental, spiritual, and financial resources to replace both with a society that is healthy for all living beings. This is not possible with limited resources. Despite reaching for common goals, organizations, and I know there are people in here who will relate to this, and campaigns involved in peace work compete for funding and members. It appears to me that for many years, campaigns to raise awareness of and reverse the course of catastrophic violence have fared poorly in this competition. The unremitting suffering caused by structural violence demands attention on a daily basis. Making the case for urgent, persistent action to avert collective human suicide seems nearly impossible. However naive I may be, I cannot believe that there are not among those with great wealth a few individuals capable of grasping the costs and ultimate consequences of catastrophic violence. Now, I know that means that we have to believe that all billionaires, in every billionaire there is that of God, and that may be a little hard to swallow. But there've got to be a few where that's the case. These net worth individuals should be motivated to endow nonviolent training academies and interdisciplinary nonviolent research centers on a scale that, while not matching the military institutions and think tanks that now hold sway over the world, they could empower and sustain nonviolent contingents for peace building, conflict resolution, service to humanity. Building up those that have labored so long on a shoestring and recruiting and preparing new troops. The notion of international peace brigades that originated with Gandhi and that Muste and others attempted to carry forward in the early 1960s as the World Peace Brigade might at last become realistic. Our own country may be too besotted with militaristic myths and performances to explore new options. But I bet that among the inhabitants of the 191 states that have joined the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, there are many who would welcome nonviolence. I may need that water. Thank you. There are many who would welcome nonviolence training and opportunities to serve in nonviolent brigades and related initiatives. Muste sometimes attributed failures to address catastrophic violence to a collective failure to value human life. I mentioned this yesterday, and I think I didn't do him justice in terms of what he actually said, but after 3 Vietnam War protesters died by self-immolation in the United States in 1965, and we've noted today that those acts recently repeated in front of the Israeli embassy, Muste counseled others contemplating the course of action to practice civil disobedience instead. And when he did that, he wasn't in any way minimizing or not understanding what the protesters were doing by giving up their lives. I think he was just not wanting to encourage other people in the movement to jump on a bandwagon. But he also framed the self-immolations as not abnormal, and these are his words, in a society composed of people who somehow feel that the death of millions in war is somehow normal. A society in which people contemplate, for the most part, calmly, the self-immolation of the whole of mankind in a nuclear holocaust. From her vantage point as a psychiatrist, Bandy Lee identifies psychic numbing as a factor contributing to widespread avoidance of impending peril. The enormity of the threat prompts denial or drives people to soothe themselves with deceptions such as deterrence theory, which Lee describes as a gamble that we will never do what we are always ready to do, and notes that deterrence theory has little meaning to a terrorist. Lee also deplores the penchant of researchers in every field to contain their efforts within silos of spatialization, which permits each of them to label a massive problem like nuclear war as not my question to answer. Movements and institutions can also cordon themselves off from dealing with possibilities like that of the death spiral that Lee believes our society has already fallen into. While the A.J. Muste Institute, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and others carry forward the struggle against the madness of war, their work receives often less public support and understanding than other organizations that target just structural violence. And of course, those organizations are all struggling to stay afloat too. Few things frustrated Muste more than how religious institutions generally avoid confronting the blasphemy of war and the probabilities of Armageddon. He founded, and from 1951 to 1962 led a failed effort called the Church Peace Mission to convince Christian clergy and governing bodies to denounce modern war. When it closed down, he observed, to expect churches to live up to their teachings and prophetic functions in relation to war might lead to great disappointment. Nonetheless, such disappointment did not alter Muste's faith in a universe ruled by reason and love. any more than Mandy Lee's dismay at mounting evidence of a death spiral limits the case she makes for why a profound change in human consciousness is possible. While human beings are unique in their capacity for violence, they are also, she insists, unique in their capacity for greater good. Historical examples abound, though they rarely appear in history books, of how nonviolent methods, far from being passive or ineffective, as they are commonly viewed, can, and these are Lee's words, bring down empires, topple regimes, and effectuate long-lasting peace. Why do these examples and the research of social scientists documenting the efficacy of nonviolent strategies remain all but invisible in social discourse? Because, Lee indicates, violence is the paradigm for the norms, the rituals, the meanings that govern that discourse. In our legislative bodies, police and court and prison systems, schools, churches, manufacturing and national security complexes, and all avenues of communication. I cannot do justice to her dissection of the violence paradigm, but I do wish to think with you for just a minute about amplifying nonviolence. When all is said and done, it seems to me that most people regard nonviolence to be, at best, a noble value, practiced only by unusually idealistic individuals, and applicable only under certain conditions. And at worst, a belief that is illusory and dangerous. When the collective consciousness is fed a steady stream of violence, nonviolence simply cannot garner attention, let alone adoption. You have to imagine violence in order to practice it, Lee writes. The opportunities for doing so in our society are legion. Where are the opportunities for imagining nonviolence? What if the stories of all kinds of peace builders played regularly, not just blockbusters once in a while or one-offs, in theaters and movie houses and on living room television screens? What if the aspirations and emotional lives of peace builders found regular expression throughout the domains of music and the visual arts? What if public monuments to and celebrations of peace builders occupied central spots in landscapes, museums, and on national calendars around the world? What if peace building fueled discussion on blogs, podcasts, editorial pages, and other social media applications? Isn't it possible that such developments could begin to alter the collective consciousness and provide at least some impetus for a paradigm shift? Now, historians would have to be intimately involved in all of that to make sure that the distortions that we've talked about in this conference don't keep getting perpetuated in the public domain. But anyway, scholars, including Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen, Gene Sharp, Peter Ackerman, and Jack Duvall, several generations of historians in the Peace History Society, documentary biographers, including David Schock, Nancy Cates, and Bennett Singer, have amassed a wealth of evidence demonstrating the efficacy of nonviolent resistance and the salutary outcomes of organizing for justice by peaceful means. Within each instance of successful civilian resistance is not only data on training, strategy, and decision-making, but also the human drama of the resistors' lives, waiting to be lifted up into social awareness. Embedded in these studies are the experience of a multitude of individuals whose stories are surely as compelling as the stock characters of the dramas performed and streaming in our current culture. Muste's biography alone encompasses so many stirring events: sea voyages into forbidden H-bomb testing sites, standoffs against military testing enforcers in the New Mexico and Saharan deserts, national and international peace walks, the internal dynamics of which we got a little glimpse of today, and should make, some really interesting, dramatic expressions if anybody wanted to work on that. Face-to-face encounter between the United States' #1 U.S. pacifist and the United States' great adversary, Ho Chi Minh. In the documentary A.J. Muste, Radical Pacifist, David Schock has captured the resolute spirit and profound wisdom animating such events. Not yet recorded, but surely meriting the attention of present and future scholars, are untold works of conflict resolution and healing, performed decade after decade in communities large and small, nationally and across the globe. Just all the ones that we had up on the board when the foundation was talking to us yesterday, multiplied over and over. Organizations that include, just to name perhaps those best known here, the A.J. Muste Foundation, FOR, the American Friends Service Committee. The time may be right to reach out to influential and accomplished communicators, such as those who recently produced the film Oppenheimer and the New York Times series on nuclear peril titled At the Brink. Why not initiate conversations with folks like these about the rich, hidden history of the power of nonviolence and the urgency of bringing it to light? And why not capitalize on the opportunity offered by the new American Women's History Museum, while it is still in the planning stages, to make the case for honoring peace work in the U.S. and the women whose contributions to it are so inspiring and instructive? Of course, such suggestions seem fanciful, but they are not incompatible with the emphasis Lee puts on symbolic and cultural factors. And they fit with A.J. Muste's view that creating the climate for peace is an essential step in getting to a nonviolent world. He never shied away from the possibility that humans might commit collective suicide. Just as Bandy Lee concludes from her deep study of violence that the violence paradigm has reached its limits and that our last hope is a change of humanity, Muste proclaimed, in the gendered language of his generation, mankind has to find the way into a radically new world. Mankind has to become a new humanity or perish. His steadfast faith in God, which he most often expressed as a source of hope, led him in his most somber reflections to draw on the words of Job. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Muste turned often to poetry. In an essay that he titled The Fall of Man, he quoted from Robinson Jeffers' poem, Prescription of Painful Ends. Muste found its imagery, evoked by the era of World War II, resonant with the world of 1964 when he composed his essay. I'm going to conclude by reading the full poem now, because I feel that the resonance has only deepened. Prescription of Painful Ends. Lucretius felt the change of the world in his time, the great republic coming to the height whence no way leads but downward. Plato, in his time, watched Athens dance the down path. The future is ever a misted landscape. No man foreknows it, but at cyclical turns there is a change felt in the rhythm of events, as when an exhausted horse falters and recovers, then the rhythm of the running hoofbeats is altered. He will run miles yet, but he must fall. We have felt it again in our own lifetime, slip, shift, and speed up in the gallop of the world, and how, suspect that, come peace or war, the progress of America and Europe becomes a long process of deterioration. starred with famous Byzantiums and Alexandrians, surely, but downward. One desires at such times to gather the insights of the age against future loss, against the narrowing mind and the tyrants, the pedants, the mystagogues, the swarms of barbarians. Time-conscious poems, poems for treasuries. Lucretius sings his great theory of natural origins and of wise conduct. Plato, smiling, carves dreams, bright cells of incorruptible wax to hive the Greek honey. Our own time, much greater and far less fortunate, has acids for honey, and for fine dreams, the immense vulgarities of misapplied science and decaying Christianity. Therefore, one christens each poem in dutiful hope of burning off at least the top crust of the time's uncleanness from the acid bottles. Thank you for listening.